Good evening, everybody. This is Sudip Parikh again. First, I just want to reflect on the excellence of the conversations that we've heard this afternoon. It's these virtual conferences have a lot going for them, but one thing they don't have is what I call that immediate feedback of an audience. And I think that if we were able to be in the same room with those panelists, I believe we would have heard some pretty thunderous applause. So both panels, the keynote this afternoon, just absolutely wonderful. And I know in our imaginations we're feeling that thunderous applause. These conversations have been insightful, they've been honest, they've been optimistic, and really covering just a ton of important ground. And I'm so excited for what's still to come tomorrow. But first, we have an absolutely wonderful event this evening. Again, these conferences have their pluses and minuses, and I'm really feeling the minuses this evening, right? Because we should be in this building where I'm sitting. I came into the office today because I wanted to get the feel of what it's like to be in a 12-story building and be completely alone. This conference should be going on downstairs in the second floor. I walked through there at lunch today and there's no one there and the lights are out. And so this virtual space in which we're all sitting is going to have to take the place of that. I will miss gathering with old friends. I'll miss dropping a chocolate-covered strawberry on the floor. I will miss all those things that come from all of us being able to be in the same room. But we can get some sense of that by participating in this evening's event, which is really to announce the 2020 William D. Carey Award. It's one of the privileges of my job to get to do this. The William D. Carey Award Lecture was established in 1989 to honor former AAAS Executive Officer William D. Carey. The selected awardees are individuals who, in their own way, exemplify Mr. Carey's leadership in articulating public policy issues engendered by the application of science and technology. And I couldn't be more thrilled, I couldn't be more excited, and I couldn't be more privileged to get to present this year's award winner, who is Dr. Shirley Tillman. Shirley Tillman has contributed to U.S. science, technology, and science policy, in numerous ways, in a huge number of ways, during a career that spans academia, public service, and science leadership. Shirley was elected Princeton University's 19th president on May 5th of 2001 after serving on the faculty for 15 years. Upon completing her term in June of 2013, she returned to the faculty. During her scientific career as a mammalian developmental geneticist, she studied the way in which genes are organized in the genome and regulated during early development, and was one of the founding members of the National Advisory Council of the Human Genome Project for the NIH. During her postdoctoral studies at the NIH, she made a number of groundbreaking discoveries while participating in cloning the first mammalian gene, and then continued to make scientific breakthroughs as an independent investigator at the Institute for Cancer Research in Philadelphia, and as an adjunct associate professor of human genetics and biochemistry and biophysics at the University of Pennsylvania. Shirley received her honors BSc in chemistry from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. After 2 years of secondary school teaching in Sierra Leone, West Africa, she obtained her PhD in biochemistry from Temple in Philadelphia. She arrived at Princeton in 1986 as the Howard Pryor Professor of the Life Sciences, and 2 years later, she joined the Howard Hughes Medical Institute as an investigator. In 1998, she took on additional responsibilities as the founding director of Princeton's multidisciplinary Lewis Siegler Institute for Integrative Genomics. Shirley is renowned not only for her pioneering research, but also for her national leadership on behalf of women in science and for promoting efforts to make the early careers of young scientists as meaningful and productive as possible. She received national attention for a report on trends in the careers of life scientists that was issued in 1998 by a committee that she chaired for the National Research Council. And she's helped launch the careers of many scholars as a member of the Pew Charitable Trust Scholars Program in the Biomedical Sciences Selection Committee and the Lucille P. Markey Charitable Trust Scholar Selection Committee. From 1993 through 2000, Shirley chaired Princeton's Council on science and technology, which encourages the teaching of science and technology to students outside the sciences. Let me say that again. Encourages the teaching of science and technology to students outside the sciences. And in 1996, she received Princeton's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. She initiated the Princeton Postdoctoral Teaching Fellowship, a program across all the science and engineering disciplines that bring postdoctoral students to Princeton each year and to gain experience in both research and teaching. All of that to say that there is no one more deserving of the Carey Award this year than Dr. Shirley Tillman. I wish we were in the same room together, and Shirley, if you can turn your video on, I'm going to virtually present the award to you. I hope it's made it to you by FedEx instead of by me actually handing it to you on a stage somewhere downstairs. But please know that when this is over, I really look forward to seeing it together and being in the same room and having a wonderful conversation together that we're going to have tonight virtually. So now, actually, Shirley, did you get the award? I hope you did. Oh, good. I'm seeing a head nodding of yes. So now we're going to be very fortunate to have Shirley present the 2020 Carey Lecture. Her talk is titled Reimagining Science, the Endless Frontier for the 21st Century. And I think it's going to build on a whole lot of things that we've heard already today. I'm looking forward to it. Shirley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And good evening and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be at the moment. I was going to begin by saying that it's strange to be speaking remotely to so many people all over the world, but actually, sadly, it's starting to feel quite normal. I want to begin by thanking the AAAS for inviting me to give the William D. Carey Lecture this year. And Sudha, thank you for that gracious introduction. I'll be asking you to speak at my memorial service soon. Bill Carey, as you just heard, was the executive officer of the AAAS and the publisher of Science from 1975 to 1987. And the award was created to honor the example he set for raising and responding to the key public policy issues facing science. The extraordinary star-studded cast of public servants who have given this lecture in the past constitute a very high standard for public service. For this and many other reasons, I embark on this lecture with both humility and trepidation, especially at this moment when science is in the national spotlight and playing such a pivotal role in the fight against the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. The topics that have been addressed by the panelists this afternoon are, in my view, the most urgent and acute public policy issues we face today. How to respond to the challenges of the pandemic on the one hand, while responding to the great national awakening to the reality of systemic racism that has occurred as a seismic reaction to the recent deaths of unarmed African-American men and women at the hands of the police, beginning with George Floyd. These are not unrelated crises. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement have together held up a mirror to the American people, bringing into sharp relief the degree of systemic racism dating back to the arrival of Europeans in this country that continues to haunt and vex our society. The shocking inequities in rates of infection and morbidity that have been experienced by both Black and Latinx individuals is unacceptable in a country that prides itself on the quality of its healthcare system. Over 1,000 African Americans have died of COVID-19, 1 in 1,000, over twice the rate for white or Asian Americans. When adjusted for age, underrepresented minorities are 3 to 3.5 times more likely to have died from the disease. That statistic reflects long-standing inequities in the provision of healthcare that have been documented for decades, with few, if any, serious efforts to correct them. But they also reflect the high prevalence of risk factors like diabetes, obesity, renal and heart disease in minority communities. The cumulative effect of lifelong disparities in food security, in quality, education, housing, and employment. The pandemic is a short-term issue for us, one that will, I'm confident, be overcome by the extraordinary efforts of scientists around the world. Combating racism and its toxic residue will be much harder to achieve and will be a long-term challenge for all of us. Closer to home, the mirror also brings into sharp focus the long-standing underrepresentation for African Americans, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples in STEM, and the role that racism in all its conscious and unconscious forms has played in their exclusion. This is a difficult moment for the scientific community, as we have long believed in the objectivity of scientific truth. Science is the purest meritocracy and the fairness of our vaunted peer review system. Women have known for a long time that there are chinks in that armor of virtue, but it has been social scientists who have provided us with the hard evidence to reveal the unconscious and implicit bias that permeate much of what we do. With greater self-awareness of our human frailties, including what appears to be a deep-seated instinct to prefer those who resemble ourselves, we can hope that that elusive progress that has stymied so many well-meaning programs designed to expand the participation of women and underrepresented minorities in science will finally be within our reach. Knowing that the panels would cover in much greater detail the policy implications of these recent events, I titled this lecture, Reimagining Science, the Endless Frontier for the 21st Century. Obviously, Vannevar Bush has been on my mind. Over the years, whenever I need inspiration, I return to and reread his extraordinarily influential report, Science, the Endless Frontier. The 75th anniversary of that landmark publication this year has given us opportunities to reflect on Bush's remarkable foresight and to ask ourselves what, if anything, needs to be changed or modified about the plan. In the course of this collective deliberation, many of us, certainly including me, have come to the conclusion that his vision of science as an ecosystem in which the government takes on primary responsibility for funding basic or fundamental discovery, and in so doing feeds the private sector's ability to turn that knowledge into products that benefit society. That remains valid today and has served the country and the world remarkably well. Yet there are those, including my admirable friend and colleague, MIT's president, Raphael Reif, who've raised concerns recently about the nimbleness, the speed, the efficiency of that handoff, especially in comparison to the far more centralized efforts in China to move discoveries in critical fields such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence out of the labs and into the hands of industry. In other words, there is a gap in the middle of the ecosystem that is slowing down the ability of the US to capitalize on our investments in science. The solution? In May, Senators Chuck Schumer of New York and Todd Young of Indiana introduced into the Senate a bipartisan bill they call the Endless Frontier Act, whose goal is to fund research, technology transfer, and workforce expansion in 10 key areas of technology. The bill would create a new directorate in the National Science Foundation and a commitment of $100 billion. Yes, that is billions with a B, over 5 years. To put an exclamation point on the proposal, they propose to rename the NSF the National Science and Technology Foundation. Now, the mission of the new directorate would overlap to some extent that of the rest of the NSF, whose budget it would dwarf by funding basic research in key technology areas. But it would be far more explicitly and intentionally investing in research that from the outset has the potential to serve specific societal goals related to economic competitiveness, manufacturing, national security, energy and the environment, health, education, and workforce development. In other words, the kitchen sink. The bill also calls for the establishment of regional technology hubs with the very laudable goal of spreading the epicenters of science and technology out of what Don Brown of the Carnegie Institute in Baltimore calls the black holes of science, Boston and the Bay Area, so that the manifold economic benefits that those regions have enjoyed by being surrounded by excellent research universities can be enjoyed by a greater percentage of the country. As I have thought about the rationale for creating a new, powerful directorate for the NSF to bridge what is often called the valley of death between research and development, I find myself at somewhat of a disadvantage as a life scientist. I have at times described myself as the oldest living molecular biologist who has not started a company, and do so, by the way, with no particular pride. I have a hard time believing that there exists in my own field a $100 billion hole in the ecosystem. All you have to do is count the number of biotech companies that have been founded in the wake of the discovery of the gene editing tool CRISPR-Cas9, a groundbreaking technology that was very appropriately awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last week to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. Those companies were incorporated in Delaware before the ink was dry on the founding scientific papers, and venture capitalists were pounding at the doors to get in on the action. It was a metaphorical equivalent of the start of the Indianapolis 500. But in a way, that's beside the point. The point, and why I would support this bill, is its goal of attracting new support for the physical sciences and mathematics. As a country, we have long been significantly underinvesting in those sciences, the purview of the NSF, whose FY 2020 budget is $8.3 billion compared to $41.6 billion for the NIH, a five-fold difference. I recall the shock some years ago hearing an NSF director explain to a group of Research One university presidents that we should advocate for more support for the NSF because the life sciences need more chemists, physicists, computer sciences, and mathematicians. First, I simply couldn't believe that an NSF director was unable to make a more compelling case for the disciplines he oversees. Then I realized that he was simply being pragmatic. Atoms and accelerators, black holes and extrasolar planets, the Earth's crust and its ocean, strings and proofs do not get cancer, nor do they age in a way that motivates the geriatric Congress to act. So as I reimagine the endless frontier, I can see a new federal investment in the ecosystem that would accelerate discovery in areas in which we have been underinvesting for years, targeting both bottom-up curiosity-driven research, as well as some carefully and hopefully wisely chosen top-down projects that are in the national interest to develop. To be successful and to accomplish the nimble handoff of new discoveries to those who can turn them into benefits, the directorate would have to encourage greater coordination between academia, government, and industry than exists at the present time. But there is a risk inherent in this plan that I foresee. To gradually, maybe even unintentionally, as the behemoth technology directorate gains strength and support, begin to erode support for fundamental curiosity-driven research, which has been the bedrock of the work that the NSF supports. Here, Vannevar Bush was at his most eloquent throughout the 1945 report when he wrote, "Today, it is truer than ever that basic research is the pacemaker of technological progress." And then he rationalized the investment by saying, "A nation which depends upon others for its new scientific knowledge will be slow in its industrial progress and weak in its competitive position in world trade, regardless of its mechanical skills." Or, as Abraham Flexner wrote in 1939 in Harper's Magazine, "Don't ever underestimate the usefulness of useless knowledge." The case can be made in virtually all scientific fields. instances in which basic research paid unexpected dividends. After all, CRISPR-Cas9 grew out of a Spanish scientist's curiosity about unusual DNA repeat sequences in the genome of an obscure bacterium. And now it is on the brink of eliminating genetic diseases like sickle cell anemia. Basic research is our seed corn, without which there will be no new technologies and their accompanying benefits to society. Bush, the MIT engineer, knew this, and we forget it at our peril. Let me turn to one idea raised in the endless frontier that has not been fully realized, but needs attention as we reimagine the endless frontier. Bush was clear that as important as the level of funding is, the stability and the predictability of that funding is critical to creating a robust scientific enterprise. Science does not work on annual cycles. It takes sustained and predictable commitment to both people and programs. No better cautionary tale illustrating the importance of stable and predictable funding exists than the classic good news, bad news story of the doubling of the NIH budget between 1998 and 2003. That provision of significant new funds, surely welcomed and celebrated by the community at the time, was followed, some would say predictably, as the Congress rested on its funding laurels, with fallow years that did great harm to the enterprise. In the boom years, universities and research institutes expanded their faculties and laboratories in the expectation that happy days were here to stay. And when the tide turned, scientists lost their funding, and debt service and O&M on those new buildings was harder to fund. The NIH had been caught flat-footed, with no plan for how to manage the post-5-year expansion era. In the end, it was a classic example of no good deed goes unpunished. What a number of us, and most especially Harold Varmus, the former director of both the NIH and the National Cancer Institute, and Keith Yamamoto, chair of the Commission on Life Sciences, have been proposing for some time now, is to require the NIH director to provide to the Congress each year a rolling 5-year non-binding appropriations forecast. This would enhance the ability of the agency to maintain its multi-year grant portfolios and remind the Congress that out-year commitments have already been made. The idea is not to tie the hands of appropriators, not that they would agree to this, but to remind them annually that science works on longer horizons than annual appropriations. There are precedents for this kind of annual forecasting, including the Future Years Defense Program. It would address a critical aspect of governmental funding that Bush anticipated but did not solve 75 years ago. Now let me turn to another issue that Bush devoted a significant fraction of his report to: education. I've always believed that the most daring and original idea in Science: The Endless Frontier was the recommendation to link the conduct of research with the education of future scientists in the nation's universities. This was far from an obvious idea at the time, coming immediately after the success of the national laboratories at Los Alamos, Lawrence Berkeley, and Oak Ridge in developing the bomb. It put the conduct of science in the hands of beginners, students and fellows who were in the process of learning their craft. But Bush was clear about why he advocated for educational institutions over government labs. It is chiefly in these institutions, he wrote, that scientists may work in an atmosphere which is relatively free from the adverse pressure of convention, prejudice, and commercial necessity. At their best, they provide the scientific worker with a strong sense of solidarity and security, as well as a substantial degree of personal intellectual freedom. All of these factors are of great importance in the development of new knowledge, since much of new knowledge is certain to arouse opposition because of its tendency to challenge current beliefs or practice. I'm going to apologize to everybody behind me. There is a lawn care group right outside my window that I'm not going to be able to stop, I don't think. I'm going to carry on though. I wish Bush would take great pride in the role. I think Bush would take great pride in the role that US universities have played in the global science ecosystem over the last 75 years, just as he anticipated. Whatever ranking system you care to consult, including those that have strong nationalistic tendencies, US universities consistently rank among 15 or so of the top 20 and are universally acknowledged to be the research powerhouses of the world. There's no better evidence of this claim than the behavior of students and fellows who come from all over the world, at least until recently, to study here. I've always claimed that if you want to know where science is going, watch how students and fellows decide what to do. So while there are stresses and strains, to be sure, in general, the universities are fulfilling their role in the ecosystem with distinction. But it is worth taking a few moments to consider those stresses and strains and what changes in policy might mitigate them. I do so by focusing on my own field, life sciences, but I'm increasingly worried that the issues we face are not unique to us. David Baltimore, the former president of Caltech and Rockefeller University, managed to encapsulate the problem in one simple sentence. There are too many people chasing too little money. The symptoms of that dilemma are the extended length of training of students and fellows, to the point where the average age of a newly minted investigator receiving his or her first independent NIH grant has been over 40 years for some time now. No one in their right mind believes this is optimal, or even for either the individual or for the generation of great science. The other symptom of the problem is hypercompetition for everything from publishing papers to competing for grants to finding positions, leading to loss of morale, risk aversion that depresses the likelihood of making groundbreaking discoveries, and a growing skepticism among the young that science offers a fair or rewarding career for them. Now, we've arrived at this problem because we ignored two recommendations that Bush made in The Endless Frontier. Although he never really called for a national policy for workforce development, he laid out two important workforce ideas. First, that students and fellows should be supported by fellowships and scholarships that gave them the independence to study what most interested them. But he made it clear that the provision of those fellowships and scholarships should be linked to the needs of the national scientific workforce. The aging of the independent investigator and the hyper competition that has eroded the attractiveness of careers in biomedical science today is the consequence of ignoring those two provisos. Over the last 40 to 50 years, the NIH has ceded any control over the number of trainees it supports by holding the number of fellowships and training grant slots low and allowing massive growth in the number of trainees supported on research grants to be completely unregulated. Trainees lost their independence and they became de facto employees of their advisors. Since 1988, when I co-chaired the first report to study this problem called The Funding of Young Investigators in the Biological and Biomedical Sciences for the National Research Council, every group that has taken up the issue has recommended that the NIH restore the use of training grants and fellowships as the preferred way to support graduate and postdoctoral training. As compelling as that recommendation was in the past to those who studied the problem, today it takes on a new urgency as the scientific community confronts the exclusion of so many from science. Unlike the indirect support of trainees on NIH grants, where the NIH has no control, not to mention even knowledge of who is being trained with its support, training grants and fellowships give the NIH the opportunity to set standards and hold programs accountable for creating more inclusive and welcoming programs as well as monitoring the quality of the education. So the advanced age at which new investigators gain standing in the profession with the provision of a first NIH grant is only one of the factors that has led to the aging of the overall scientific workforce, a phenomenon that has been well documented. When the Congress, in its wisdom, outlawed the use of mandatory retirement in colleges and universities in 1994, it set in motion the aging of the scientific workforce today, in which there are many more grantees over the age of 65 at the NIH than there are under the age of 35, with the trend most evident among basic scientists. Given the observation that in general, groundbreaking discoveries that are awarded major prizes tend to be done early in careers, this should set off alarm bells for federal funders. Leaving the demographics of the scientific workforce to chance is akin to believing today that free and unfettered markets will guarantee the best economic outcomes for everyone. The European Research Council and the Dutch Research Council have each pioneered a new approach to supporting scientists at different career stages, recognizing that assessing promise and the expectations for success differ for those at early stages in their careers with those who are more established. By setting aside specific pots of money for early, mid, and late stage investigators and letting them compete within their age cohort, they ensure that the pipeline is always running smoothly. This strategy not only protects early stage investigators who are often the most at risk during times of limited resources, but it addresses what is quickly becoming an even more potentially vulnerable group, those who are in mid-career and still in the process of establishing their scientific reputations. It's easy to anticipate the criticism that such programs are going to attract. They appear to fly in the face of the long-standing conviction that the purpose of federal funding agencies should be to support only the very best science, irrespective of the career stage of the applicant. But as important as funding excellence is, there is another societal good that also needs to be served, to ensure that the scientific workforce is always in an optimal position to renew itself and to attract the best minds of the next generation. These two goals for science funding are not incompatible. I would even argue they're mutually reinforcing. The ERC and the Dutch Research Council have found an effective way to accomplish both. Finally, let me conclude my remarks this afternoon with an issue that Vannevar Bush never directly addressed, but I suspect it would startle and dismay him to see today: the erosion of public confidence in the ability of science to contribute to and help guide public policy. The COVID-19 pandemic has made urgent the concern that many of us have shared as we have witnessed debates about the causes and consequences of global warming, the safety of genetically modified food, the safety of vaccines such as the MMR vaccine, or the validity of the theory of natural selection and whether it should be taught in schools. At this moment, we are facing the prospect that a significant number of people, too many of them African Americans, will refuse to be vaccinated against COVID-19 because of a deep distrust, not just of the current administration, but of the medical profession and authority as a whole. Efforts to recruit individuals of color to the vaccine trials underway have been hampered by this distrust. Of course, the distrust is not without cause. African Americans have repeatedly suffered at the hands of the medical profession, for example, during the notorious Tuskegee syphilis trials, and the sterilization of women during the eugenics movement up to and including the 1970s. Nevertheless, all of us, but especially scientists, need to be worried when scientific evidence is weighed no more heavily than uninformed opinions or beliefs. Or as the president said recently, I don't think science knows, actually. The challenge we face is to understand a paradox. The good news is that public opinion polls have consistently and over a long period of time reported general confidence in scientists as a profession and the use of public funds for research. A 2019 Pew Research Center survey found that Americans have a generally positive view of science and scientists and report a fair amount of confidence that scientists will act in the best interests of the public. This view was reinforced by a 2018 study by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences entitled Perceptions of Science in America. That study found that while attitudes are generally positive, they vary according to educational level, with adults without a high school diploma less likely than college graduates to view science as beneficial. Yet the picture is not that straightforward. For example, one's affinity group can outweigh the influence of education. Republicans, even with high educational attainment, are much more likely to deny that human activity plays a role in global warming. The anti-vaccine movement was ignited by one British doctor and a well-debunked report in a British medical journal, but it was taken up by educated women on the West Coast of the US, ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Brooklyn, and believe it or not, chiropractors in Arizona. The politicization of science and public resistance to its discoveries are hardly new phenomena. They've been around at least since Galileo removed the Earth from the center of the universe, and Darwin and Wallace made monkeys of our ancestors. A common feature of such moments in history is the rapidity and the shock of change, and the difficulty in adjusting one's worldview to new insights from science. But what feels different to me today is the powerful megaphone that social media has created, both to spread and then amplify anxiety or uncertainty, which can often begin as a legitimate concern, but can explode in conspiracy theory. A more insidious phenomenon is the purposeful dissemination of misinformation by bad actors with malice aforethought. So the usual response of the scientist to misunderstanding or misinformation is to do what we do best: fall back on evidence, data, and argue our case in a clear and rational and sometimes condescending manner. We're learning, however, from those self-same social scientists I mentioned earlier, that this approach is more likely to dig someone's heels deeper into the ground than to change their minds. So I end with a plea that as we reimagine the endless frontier, which seems to me to be as glorious today as it was in 1945, we must aim to be more effectively engaged with the people who support our work. We need to learn new ways to partner, and I use that word advisedly, with those who will benefit from our research. Some of the best examples I have seen recently embrace that old adage, think globally, act locally. Clinical scientists, for example, are learning how to bring their patients into their work, to share with them their findings, and ask their help in understanding the experiences of their diseases more deeply. Agricultural scientists in Minnesota have engaged local farmers by first asking them what they need to be more productive, and then working side by side with them to solve their problems. Recently, the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group that I co-chair with Harvey Feinberg issued a report on vaccine hesitancy that found that the single most effective way to persuade a hesitant mother to vaccinate her children is a one-on-one conversation with a sympathetic nurse or pediatrician who was willing to sit and listen to her concerns. And speaking of listening, we're also going to need those social and behavioral scientists to develop a greater understanding of how cultural experience and group identities shape trust in scientific research. and how best to address skepticism of well-established scientific findings. We need to find ways to use social media more effectively to counter misinformation about science. There's a lot to do, but Vannevar Bush would have expected nothing less from us than our best effort. So once again, thank you for the great honor of this award and for the opportunity to speak to all of you today.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And again, in this virtual setting, you're not hearing the thunderous applause that I know you would get for a talk that was just huge in scope and really worthy of the title and worthy of the reference to Vannevar Bush. Covered so much ground. I'm excited to have a few minutes to have a conversation about it. Now, normally we would have a reception right after this where wine and hors d'oeuvres would be served. And Shirley, I would have snuck you a glass of wine ahead of time so that we could have this conversation in a more relaxed setting. So not having that with us, we're gonna plow through. I'd love to start. You touched on something really early in your discussion. You talked about the meritocracy, and you alluded to the fact that women learned early on some of the challenges to that, the chinks in the armor, I think you said, to the meritocracy. Could you just expand on that just a little bit, just to give some setting for that? Did you experience things that come to mind? What was the reference to?
Well, I think what many of us of my generation, as we were starting to think about entering careers in science, we're either told that that is an impossible dream and that women simply don't become scientists. So think about doing something else. I had my freshman physics professor at one point tell me that women don't belong in physics. What was I possibly doing? As late as my arrival in Princeton in 1986, I had mathematicians in the math department telling me that the reason that there are no women in mathematics is that women's brains just don't work that way. So I think there were deeply held cultural views, social attitudes that simply lowered expectations for women who had decided that they really wanted to learn how to be a scientist.
Do you think that that the situation for my 10-year-old daughters is different? It will be different. Can they expect a similar story to tell, or do you think that it has that there's been improvement?
No, I think there's no question that there's been an improvement. For one thing, numbers matter. If I've learned one thing as I have worked on issues about the underrepresentation of women in science, is that numbers truly matter. And we have seen a slow but steady expansion in the number of women. In my own field in life sciences, with respect to PhDs, we're now basically at parity, where 50%, in some years even above 50% of the PhDs are being awarded to women in life sciences. As you well know, there are other fields where progress has been much slower, particularly in physics and mathematics, and in some areas of engineering, although not all areas of engineering. But the more women participate, the easier it is for someone, usually a male, to close their eyes, and when they think scientist, they can picture a woman as well as a man.
Yeah, I love it when my daughters draw scientists, and they look like themselves.
Yeah.
It's always nice. Do you think there are lessons to be learned there for the challenges around racism and other underrepresented minority challenges in the sciences? What are the lessons to be learned, and what can we, how can we put those lessons to use?
To be honest, Sudhib, I worry that this is a deeper problem. After all, women are 50% of the human race, right? And so excluding a group that was not, by any definition, a minority, I think just became unconscionable and it's far more difficult to do. I think it's going to be harder. I'm optimistic, but I think it's going to be harder in part because I think the experience of being a minority has a profound effect on an individual from birth. You know, no woman has that experience until they get into a position where they are a minority. But if you are from an underrepresented group, and particularly if you live in a society that has undervalued minority participation, I think it's going to be much more challenging for us, which means we just have to work much harder at it.
Yeah, Shirley, thank you for that. Your words in that conversation are so meaningful. You know, you've been an advocate for a long time. Even when you were at the bench, you were an advocate. Can you put this era into context? You talked about the doubling of the NIH. That was an opportunity in the late 90s that was spurred. What is there a parallel moment in history that we can look to, or is this really its own moment? And what can we learn in terms of how to get some of those good positives that you talked about, you know, the bills that you talked about, et cetera, into place? What's the context of the moment?
You know, in a strange kind of way, I think we're really at a remarkable place, partly because of COVID. And I think that I have never seen people as interested in science, as dependent on science rescuing them from this terrible pandemic. And so I actually think this is a moment to capitalize on what we know science has the capacity to do to, you know, improve human lives. We have to be careful though, and I think actually with the development of the vaccines that are underway, one of the things we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over and over again is that this is a global pandemic. And creating a vaccine that will only be able to be distributed and paid for in the developed world is not a solution. So we also have to be terribly conscious of the context, the global context in which we are looking for scientific solutions to global problems. But I'm actually thinking this might be a wonderful time to really make the best case for science.
I agree with you. I want to be mindful of other people's questions. I have so many more, but there are a lot showing up in the Q&A box, so I'm going to turn to some of those. Let's see here. I'll start with Juan's question. On a personal note, I celebrate the renovated chances for the Endless Frontier Act to increase research spending for collaboration with U.S. allies, partners, and international organizations. And then a question from Amanda says, how can funding agencies facilitate fair partnerships across different types of educational institutions when there's a disparity of resources, you know, between R1 institutions and others? How do we facilitate fair partnerships?
Yeah. So if we just are talking within the United States, I think one of the things that I do admire in the Frontier Act is the intention, the purposeful intention of creating really hubs of scientific and technological excellence outside of what I call the black holes, which are Boston and San Francisco. Clearly, there is a huge amount of untapped talent around the country that is being untapped simply because of the maldistribution of scientific resources. And you know, I think it comes back to this false sense of a meritocracy. Oh, but we're only going to give the money to the very, very, very best, and that's all that matters. I think there's lots of arguments to be made that by distributing the funds more broadly geographically, we will in fact increase the quality of science. There's nothing about the Bay Area and Boston that makes them uniquely able to produce fantastic science.
That's terrific. I have another question here from Roger. You didn't mention that there has been a fundamental change in where STEM graduates are employed. In the past, they were largely employed by academia, promoting the cloning the advisor mode. Currently, most graduates are now employed in industry. What's your assessment of how universities have adapted?
I think universities have adapted far too slowly to the fact that, what the questioner said is absolutely correct. When I was entering the job market after my postdoc, something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of life sciences were going into academia. Today, that number is under 15%. And what a number of us have been arguing, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, that we need to rethink graduate education, because now the academic track is now becoming an alternative career, not the major career, but an alternative career. And I think really creative graduate programs should be starting to think about how to tailor their graduate program with the intent of making it more attractive to people who aren't interested in academic careers. So I think we've responded to the trend very slowly, and far too slowly.
Do you think other countries have done a better job of that, or we have the research powerhouses here? It doesn't feel like anyone's done it much better.
I agree with you. I don't see any place that has really championed how to do this differently. But I think it could be a way to reimagine the endless frontier.
Going back to the endless frontier, Heather asks, you've talked about public funding in basic fundamental research and private sector funding for commercial pursuits. What about public interest science that might not be fundamental, but is still crucial for the public good, like assessing environmental and health impacts of commercial activity? Where does that fit in the scientific enterprise that you've described?
I think if I might just back up 1 second and say, I think there is a new source of funding that certainly didn't exist when Bush was imagining his ecosystem, and certainly has not played a major role until very recently, which is the role of philanthropy. And philanthropy, really in the first time in my lifetime, is now becoming a highly influential source of funds. I think if you probably the most extreme example is the Gates Foundation, but in the UK, the Wellcome Trust is a powerhouse of funding for science. So I think the kind of public interest support of science is going to have to be shared between the government, which does its share of this kind of support. But in addition, what I see is a real opportunity for philanthropists to step in and fund projects of that kind.
Great. All right. Deborah asks, do you have ideas or thoughts about how we can use conversations about coronavirus research to help rectify what you quite rightly identify as a problem with the perception of science in broader society, at least among some? How do we use coronavirus research to have that conversation?
Well, I'm very much hoping that coronavirus will be, the best case study that you could possibly have, not only for how we're going to get through this pandemic, but I think just as importantly, for why investments in public health, for example, are going, which we basically forgot about in the last 25 or 30 years. Why we need to make far better investments in public health. But I think between the development of a vaccine in record time, I think the record for producing a vaccine in the past was something in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 years. We're doing it in less than a year now. And some of the reason we're doing it is because of past investments in fundamental science. I think therapeutics, I think despite whether the Regeneron monoclonal antibodies are really going to have the impact that the president claims they have had on him, the fact that there are so many companies working on therapeutics that will attack the virus and its impact on the body in so many different ways grew out of a deep commitment to this kind of research, virology, immunology, physiology, that is now paying dividends. So I think we have a great case study, and now we have to go out and make that case.
Great. Shirley, I'm going to ask just two more questions, and then we are going to take a little break and then go to a virtual cocktail hour, however that works. But in those two questions, the first I'm going to ask is something simple and close to home, which is you've had a lot of roles over your career, a lot of different roles, and which of those have you, looking back, would you say is the place where you felt like you had the most impact and you had the most fun? Sometimes those are the same and sometimes they're different, but where do you feel like if you wanted to just look back and say, what's the part where I really enjoyed myself, or the part where I felt like, man, I made a difference? Which are they?
Sudip, you're asking me to make a Sophie's choice.
Oh, okay.
Because, my life in science was one of the most rewarding and happy times of my life. I adored being a scientist. I adored being a teacher. I loved the freedom to be able to decide what I was going to study, and then to figure out how to understand the natural world in greater depth. But I also have to say that being the president of Princeton was an extraordinary experience, richly rewarding, a great deal of fun, believe it or not. I know people say that university presidents are some of the long-suffering people on earth, but actually I had a great time. I loved it. Princeton is very kind to its presidents. And so it would be impossible for me to answer that question.
I think that's a lovely answer, actually. That there's in all of those roles, there's much to be enjoyed and much to be impacted. And I'm hoping that some of our audience who are more junior can look at that and see a path and see something to strive for. My second question is a broader question, and hopefully one that matches the scope of your talk, which is with all these opportunities that you see, what is your most optimistic hope for what the scientific enterprise can accomplish over the next 10 years? Is it in the life sciences? Is it in the healthcare? Is it in the awe-inspiring? What is it? Particularly from the university president's side, you see a broad scope of science. What is it that you're excited about? What should we be looking forward to?
Again, it's a little bit of a Sophie's choice, in that I have a lot of things that I would really hope for, but maybe the thing I hope for the most is that we can make the case for why, your 12-year-old daughter, 10-year-old daughter, and my 7-year-old granddaughter, and students all over the world who are sort of think science is cool, but that we can make the case for why science can make such a tremendous impact in the world, which I really believe it can, and why a career in science, and this is why I've spent so many years worrying about young investigators. I want a career path in science to look like the most exciting and promising thing that a person could decide to do with their life. And the degree to which we've stumbled and made mistakes and created stresses and strains that make it less attractive, I think is deeply problematic. So making science welcoming to as diverse and as excited a group of young people as possible.
Shirley, I think that answer encapsulates why you are the Bill Carey Award winner this year. Thank you so much for both accepting the award and for giving the talk. And I look forward to the cocktail hour here in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for sticking with us through the afternoon.